Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here today. These events are made truly special because of your attendance and participation. I also want to welcome those who are watching this event via the Ripon College Live Events YouTube channel. I am Henrik Schatzinger, co-director of the Center for Politics and the People. It is my honor to introduce to you our speaker for today's talk, whose work I often use in the classroom and who I greatly respect. Matt Grossman is an associate professor of political science at Michigan State University. He is also the director of the Institute for Public Policy and Social Research, which serves as Michigan State's Office for Survey Research, the Michigan Political Leadership Program, the State of the State Survey, and the Michigan Applied Public Policy Research Program. Professor Grossman earned his bachelor's degree at Claremont McKenna College and his master's and PhD in political science at Berkeley University. Professor Grossman has published several books, including Artists of the Possible, Governing Networks and American Policy Change since 1945, and The Not So Special Interests, Interest Groups, Public Representation, and American Governance. Professor Grossman has published numerous peer-reviewed articles in journals such as American Politics Research, Interest Groups and Advocacy, and the Journal of Politics. He has also been the editor of several books. Today he is here to talk about his most recent book, which was published last year by Oxford University Press, entitled Asymmetric Politics, Ideological Republicans and Group Interest Democrats. After the talk, we will have time for questions from the audience. Please join me in welcoming Matt Grossman.
Thanks for coming. Today we're talking about differences between Democrats and Republicans. It's a fun time to be doing that. Most of the material comes from my newly published book with David Hopkins, but we'll get a chance to see what the latest election and the Trump administration have changed and not changed about the political parties. So we got to thinking about how different the parties were and how to describe those differences, and we rely on some long-running sort of banal observations about the two parties. One, that the Democratic Party is a rainbow coalition of minorities when it comes to the electorate, and the Republican Party is a more homogeneous anti-government base. At the elite level, the conservative movement triumphed within the Republican Party. But Democratic politicians have always been a little bit reluctant to embrace full-throated liberalism. So we try to build from these basic observations to characterize the two parties. The Republicans as the agent of an ideological movement, and the Democrats as a coalition of social groups, each with a different pragmatic policy concern. And we think that the two parties operate within what I'll call the two faces of American public opinion. We have long had more Democrats than Republicans, but more conservatives than liberals. So this is, the dotted line is the percent Democrat out of all those that identify as Democrats or Republicans, and the black line is the percent liberal out of all those that identify as liberals or conservatives. There's always been a gap. There's been changes. Liberalism declined and maybe on a slightly recent upsurge. But as a result of this, the Republicans have always been more homogeneously conservative in ideological identification, whereas less than half of Democrats have usually identified as liberals. And it extends beyond identifications to questions of public policy. And again, we get a sort of a two-faced public opinion. Whenever asked a general question about the size and scope of government, about social traditions, about American nationalism, the public is more likely to give a conservative answer. But whenever asked very similar questions about specific public policy questions within each of those domains, Americans have been likely to give liberal answers. So the simplest example is Americans want a small government that does less except they want more spending in healthcare, more spending in education, more spending across the board. And it turns out not to just be a question of spending, but when it comes to regulation, similarly. They want less involvement in business, they want less regulation overall, except they want more environmental regulation, they want more consumer regulation, and you go down the list of the individual things that government does, and the public usually expresses support for more of those things. Now, sometimes, if you're on one of these two sides, you might take only one as the truth, and say, okay, well, people may say they're for a smaller government that does less, or they're for more social traditions, but actually they endorse all these liberal policy positions. And that's true, but we don't think that either one is sort of the true public opinion. We think that Americans hold both attitudes simultaneously. When they, in general terms, want a government that does less, while also in specific terms endorsing most of the public policy goals of the American government, and the same thing goes for foreign policy and moral issues as well. So this presents a potential majority for each political party. Whenever the Republicans are speaking in broad terms about conservative ideological principles, they can reach a majority. And whenever the Democrats are speaking in narrow, specific terms to different audiences, they can cobble together a majority based on different policy issue concerns of different social groups. But it means that the parties look quite different in terms of their ideological distribution. And here I'm trying to show you that it's not just the word conservative that's more popular than the word liberal. Democrats often try to change the name. Democrats are now calling themselves progressives. But in fact, it is a very long-running pattern no matter how you label the ends of the scale. So this is from an international survey where we label the ends left and right and ask people to place themselves on a 10-point scale. And you can see that Republicans place themselves on the right, whereas Democrats basically place themselves in the middle of the ideological distribution. There's also more Democrats who don't want to place themselves on this scale at all, who don't think of politics in an ideological term, in an ideological debate between left and right. And the same is true no matter how you label the endpoints. Now, this does not mean that Republicans hold more consistent positions. In fact, it's the opposite. If we cobble together people's ideology by asking them 30 specific policy issue questions, you would see the opposite graph. You would see Democrats actually have more consistent policy positions, whereas Republicans are all over the map. So it's only because we are thinking of politics in ideological terms here that you get Republicans placing themselves consistently on the right. Now, Democrats don't always just think of politics in terms of individual policy issues. They also do have a way of bringing all those policy issues together, and it's to think of politics in terms of group conflict. That is, they're not always thinking specifics, they're sometimes thinking more generally about the debate between the parties. And this is a typical answer given by a Democratic activist about what they like about the Democrats and dislike about the Republicans. It says Democrats are the party of the common man, Republicans are for all of these people, right? For rich, mainly white, older folks, quite judgmental, unconcerned for their fellow Americans. So that's not really about policy, that's about the people who are in each political party. The Republican answers, typical Republican answers, are also not too policy related. They say Democrats promote all of these isms, and Republicans are for an overall reduction in the size and scope of government. And these turn out to be fairly typical answers given by Democrats and Republicans. Here we've kind of categorized them based on whether they give us anything that looks like an ideological description, or if they can't give us that, we see if they've given us anything that looks like a group-based description. And it's been true for a long time that the more Democratic you are, the more likely you are to give a group-based answer, and the more Republican you are, the more likely you are to be giving an ideological-based answer of the differences between the political parties. But notice there's a whole lot of people here in the middle who don't give either one, and we have a whole lot of people who we categorize as nature of the times voters, and they just say, things aren't going very well, I want to throw the bums out, or things are going well, so we'll re-elect them. And then there's a sizable portion of the public who, when asked things they like and dislike about the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, don't give us any answers or give us answers that are sort of unclassifiable. They're really specific attributes of the candidates, for example. But this difference pertains to the strongest partisans in the electorate, rather than necessarily the electorate as a whole. But the electorate as a whole, I would argue, does recognize the strengths and weaknesses of each political party. So here we asked people which party is better at, and then we gave them 4 things. Now it's a really hard thing to admit that your party is not better at something. So a lot of people would just say, oh, Republican, 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 or the reverse for Democrats. But you can see that as a whole, people do give a couple things to the Democrats and a couple things to the Republicans. And they correspond to these differences that I found. If we ask the public which is better at speaking up for disadvantaged groups in our society, the vast majority of people say Democrats. Some Republicans even acknowledge that. But if we ask who's speaking for shared American principles and values, a plurality give us the Republican answer. So Democrats are less likely to say that their party is better at that. When it comes to policy, if we ask about proposing specific policies to solve social problems, people give that one to the Democrats. But when asked about ensuring that government stays in its proper role in our society overall, they give that one to the Republicans. So I think the public recognizes, to some extent, the differences between the parties and credits them for what their party tends to emphasize. That is, Republicans tend to emphasize the overall size and scope of government and our shared principles and values. The Democrats tend to emphasize speaking up for disadvantaged groups and proposing specific policies to solve the problems that they have. But it also has implications for elected officials. Because Republicans tend to think in ideological terms, they also tend to not be very supportive of politicians who make compromises in order to get something done. Instead, they're more supportive of politicians who stick to principles. And we see this quite commonly, of course, when it came to the Tea Party and the Freedom Caucus in Congress. We're just arguing that they're responding to a real difference in the two electorates. The Republicans do really want their leaders to stick it out and stay for the principles, and Democrats really do want their leaders to compromise in the service of getting some kind of action from government. So we think that what you see in American politics is a self-reinforcing process that makes the two parties quite distinct. They have different electorates, they rely on different information, they hear different campaign messages, they, when in office, have different policy-making goals, and that makes them look quite different in their governing, which helps to reinforce their different public reputations that I just showed you. So we've gone through and collected quite a bit of data about how the parties are different in their self-presentation, and what we find is consistent with our overall view. This happens to be from nomination speeches at party conventions. This is a summary measure since 1948, and what we find is that Republicans tend to speak in terms of conservative principles, but they don't necessarily follow it up with too many conservative policies. Whereas Democrats tend to speak in a little bit more in policy terms or in social or interest group terms, and are a little bit more two-faced when it comes to having some liberal and conservative principles. So this is most famously Bill Clinton declared that the era of big government is over right before listing 30 additional things that he wanted government to do, right? So that has been the kind of two-faced presentation that the Democrats have given. And similarly, the Republicans have been more likely to emphasize the principles and less the policies. This is the same kind of data from party platforms. You can see again, Republicans are talking in terms of conservative principles, a little bit less in terms of policies. In fact, actually, we coded up all the policies that they mentioned in their platforms, and almost as many liberal policies were mentioned as conservative policy proposals. So they know that America doesn't necessarily follow up with their support for conservative principles by saying we want to reduce education spending or reduce healthcare spending, so they often put in some liberal policies in with the conservative rhetoric. So we've looked at a lot of the same type of coding scheme for everything from television transcripts to speeches and hearings in Congress, to presidential speeches, anything that you can think of, and we get this same basic pattern. Republicans emphasizing principles, Democrats emphasizing social or interest groups. but it's also reflected in the actual organizations within each political party. This is just a depiction from Daniel DeSalvo of the factions that participated in internal party organization conflicts. And what we had basically until the 1970s was a three-part dispute within the Democratic Party between Southerners, who are disproportionately conservative, an old liberal faction based around organized labor, and a identity politics based coalition that arose in the 1960s. And what happened is they sort of reached a consensus of sorts, mostly to the advantage of the identity politics faction. But then, immediately, a faction arose to say that there had been a mistake. It was an ideological faction, but it was an ideological faction that wanted to push the party back to the center rather than towards the left. It was the New Democrats. And they said, okay, these elections that we lost badly in the 1980s, we need to move back to the center, and that's what gave us the Clintons. The Republican story is a lot simpler. There was a two-faction battle between liberals and conservatives. The conservatives won, and the liberals were expunged from the party. Interestingly, the liberals and moderates actually organized around something called the Ripon Society, based around the foundations of the Republican Party right here. So what we argue is that the organizational history of the party sort of matches these rhetorical changes. It also is reflected today in how the parties are organized. This is one of my favorite studies where some political scientists signed themselves up for a lot of junk mail. They gave small donations to political party organizations and candidates to see which people were selling mailing lists to whom. So they gave a whole bunch of different pseudonyms and a whole bunch of different mailboxes, and they wanted to see who else is sending us mail. And the answer is Democrats sent a lot more junk mail from a whole lot more organizations, and it tended to be a whole bunch of interest groups representing all of the different coalitional parts of the political party. It wasn't all identity groups, it was also environmental groups and other single-issue concerns. The Republicans also shared mailing lists, but it was mostly among official party organizations and media. That is, they sold the mailing lists to conservative magazines, who could then try to get you to subscribe. And we think that this actually reflects the organizational nature of the two parties. The Democrats do have a whole bunch of single-issue groups which are attached to their political party, whereas the Republicans do have a broader media base that's attached to their political party. And it's reflected in Washington. There are just a lot more liberal single-issue groups in Washington than conservative single-issue groups. Now, overall, all of these advocacy groups are dwarfed by individual businesses and trade associations, which often ally with Republicans. So I'm not putting up this to say Democrats have the interest group advantage, but to say there's a whole lot of different single-issue groups representing Democrats, and especially if you include the ones representing identity groups that I've categorized as neither liberal or conservative, you get a big liberal coalition. So that could be a good thing. It means there's a lot of organizations to bring on board for the Democrats, but it could be a bad thing for them because it means they have a lot of different constituencies to satisfy who all have different policy priorities. And in fact, it also stands out internationally. Now, we only have two political parties, which is the fewest in the world, and so both of our parties are going to be bigger coalitions than most international political parties. And what we find here is this is actually an interesting measure that was actually designed to look at clientelism, to look at parties that are really tied to one constituency group. But what it did is it asked people what kinds of groups does each party attach to. And Democrats had the highest number of attachments of any political party in the world. They were tied to racial groups, to religious groups, to economic groups, to both unions and business. That's a pretty broad coalition compared to most international political parties. But you can see that Republicans are also higher than the median international party. But where they really stood out was on ideology. These are from expert surveys placing the political parties on different ideological dimensions. And what they find is that the Republican Party is the most conservative party in the world. By that, I just mean they're consistently conservative across all of these ideological dimensions, And no other party in the world has that composite of issue positions and beliefs. The Democratic Party, in contrast, is a fairly typical center-left party by worldwide standards. Now, interestingly, the American parties traditionally were least polarized on the dimension that they're now becoming much more polarized on, national identity. This is a question where we asked, does one party want to have basically an integration of lots of different groups, all with their own identities, versus one party wants to emphasize shared national identity to the exclusion of subgroups. And traditionally, Republicans and Democrats were actually not that far apart on this dimension. I would argue they're polarizing on this dimension quite a lot. But interestingly, the other political parties that have conservative positions on those issues, like the anti-immigration parties in Europe, do not have conservative economic policy positions. That is, they're nowhere near this level of support for conservative ideology when it comes to the economics. So what's rare in the world is that you get a party that has consistently conservative positions across the spectrum. And it is also associated with some institutions. So I said they don't have all these individual advocacy groups. They do have more think tanks, though. There's about 3 times as many conservative think tanks as liberal think tanks. And they're growing at a much faster rate. And I argue that this is because conservatives saw a need to have an ideologically defined producer of research. Who were they rebelling against here? Well, universities. That is, they thought correctly that most professors were liberals and that they needed to create their own infrastructure for the creation of research, and they did so through quite a bit of conservative think tanks. And they today provide much of the informational basis for elite Republicans. But what about the mass? Well, there, Republicans created a media infrastructure that was explicitly conservative. This happens to just show you the ratings of Fox News Channel and MSNBC over time. You can see Trump has been excellent for cable news as a whole, but you can also see that the more conservative channel has maintained a consistent lead in viewership. But it goes a lot further than this. Conservatives have had an advantage in talk radio since the 1950s. And basically have always had more ideologically explicit broadcast media. And it's extending, as we'll see in a second, to the web as well. But it isn't just that more people are watching these channels, it's that they are made possible by Republican distrust of the mainstream media. So this is asking this is the average level of trust in mainstream networks, the percent trusting minus the percent distrusting. Republicans only trust Fox News Channel. Democrats trust the mainstream networks even more than MSNBC, and they just don't trust Fox News Channel. And what this creates is a self-perpetuating cycle. It's very hard for the liberals to create an equivalent liberal media infrastructure because liberals still trust the mainstream media. Conservatives distrust the mainstream media because reporters are disproportionately liberals. That was always true. But it took a while for the conservative elites to convince the conservative public of that, just like on research. That is, conservative elites long were wary of the independent arbitrating role of universities and the mainstream media, but now the conservative public is also wary of the independent role of those two institutions, and the Republican Party has created a conservative infrastructure to match its conservative identity. It's also been true in presidential nominations. And this is just a categorization of which presidential candidates within each party got the nomination by explicitly running as the more conservative or more liberal candidate or the more moderate candidate. And there were 3 Republican presidents who won the nomination on the basis of being the most conservative, whereas there are quite a few Democratic presidential nominees that got that way by running as the more moderate candidate. On 2016, I would put both of the parties in this sort of no clear ideological appeal or compromise. Obviously, Hillary Clinton was not running as liberal of a campaign as Bernie Sanders, but she also didn't want to declare herself the more moderate option. And on this side, it turned out that Trump won the voters who were right in the middle of the Republican ideological spectrum of conservatives. He lost the very conservative people to Ted Cruz, and he lost the moderates to John Kasich in the end. So he won the bulk there in the middle of the appeal. So historically, the presidential nominations have been mixed. But there have been a whole lot more successful Republican nominees running to the right, and in fact a couple that ran twice ran to the right the second time. So Dole, H.W. Bush, McCain, and Romney, for example. It's also true in congressional elections. There's just a whole lot more Republican primary challengers that run a direct ideological appeal. They say, I'm more conservative than you. We just saw another one last week in Alabama. Take off a current elected Republican senator. It turns out it goes all the way back to at least the 1970s that Republicans were running these more ideological primary challengers, but it really amped up within the last decade with the Tea Party. They also tend to run advertising that's more ideological. This is from a characterization of congressional ads going back to the 1970s. Republican ads consistently focus overall on the size and scope of government, whereas Democratic ads are more likely to identify specific social groups and specific policy issue positions. So this difference in the parties has also played out in how they've competed within each political party to lead it. It's also played out in Congress. Obviously, we're in a time of polarization. Most people know that the Democrats and Republicans are moving apart. But I would argue that a very different thing happened in the Democratic Party and the Republican Party in Congress. The Democrats actually moved first to the left, and it was by excising the conservative Southerners. It was a loss of the South. The Northern Democrats have really been fairly stable in ideology in both the House and the Senate since the 1970s. What happened is a replacement of the most conservative part of their caucus. Whereas the Republicans really weren't moving until 1978, and then they've been on a move rightward ever since. There's actually a fairly clear historical story here, where when Reagan lost to Ford in 1976, there was an organization of all the interests behind Reagan. They started running against liberal Republicans as well as Democrats, and they successfully started moving the party to the right. It's also when Newt Gingrich was elected to Congress, and he proceeded to both institutionally move the party to the right and to recruit a new generation of more conservative congressional candidates who were then replaced by even more conservative congressional candidates who called the old conservatives the sellouts. And we get that repeated pattern in the Republican history in Congress up to the Tea Party. Now there was something happening in the Democratic Party as well, and it was diversification. The Democrats had always been, or had always been more, a diverse coalition in the electorate, but they weren't really a diverse coalition in Congress until the 1970s. This is giving you the minorities, the racial minorities, plus the religious minorities, and then plus white women. So the residual category here is Christian white males, and you can see they're now a minority of the Democratic caucus in Congress. You can also see there was a bit of a trade-off here, where when Republicans did better overall, so did minority members of the Democratic caucus become a much bigger part of their congressional delegation. So what we have today is an elite Democratic cast that represents the diversity of the Democratic electorate and also shares their myriad concerns. This is caucus membership in Congress. Democrats are a lot more likely to be in a caucus around a specific issue area or a specific constituency. You can see that they're about even when it comes to ideological membership, but that hides something, which is that Democrats are much more evenly distributed across their progressive and moderate and liberal, and conservative caucuses, whereas Republicans, almost all Republicans are in the Republican Study Committee, and then there's an even more conservative caucus to the right of them. All right, so I said in Congress we had Republicans moving to the right, and we had Democrats losing their Southern partners and becoming more liberal as a result, but much earlier. But that hasn't necessarily resulted in conservative public policy. That is, most times when we make new policy, when we pass new laws, we do things to expand the size and scope of government. Most new laws are liberal. This is true in almost all over the world, but it tends to be not, I think, focused on enough. Why are the Republicans more averse to having more policy making? Why are they more okay with gridlock? Because when government is doing more, it is usually moving policy to the left. When we're passing more laws, we tend to be getting more liberal overall. So what this shows you is the total number of significant policy changes per year. You can see up to the 1970s, we basically were passing nearly all liberal policy. And then we started to reduce the amount of policy making, and with it, the liberalism of that policy. But look at this from a conservative perspective. We rarely get below zero. That is, we rarely get more conservative policy changes than liberal policy changes. It really only happened once in 1994 when the Republicans took over Congress. And otherwise, we've been basically passing more liberal laws than conservative laws. And so what that means is the typical pattern is that even with Republican leadership, we still get a few more liberal laws than conservative laws, such as George W. Bush, who was able to pass tax cuts, but he also passed expansion of the education, federal education program, expansion of the Medicare program, several other laws that moved policy to the left. And as a result, you see Democrats passing a lot more laws than Republicans, and you also see a difference in who passes the laws. Democrats tend to be based on their leadership and their committee chairs, whereas Republicans have a lot more power for their backbenchers, and I think we continue to see that today. So what does this mean, that Democrats are the only ones that pass laws? Well, no, typically we have bipartisan laws. Another thing that we don't usually say enough about when laws pass. That is, this is major laws passed in Congress over time, and the blue line is those that pass with a Republican and Democratic majority, at least in one of the chambers of Congress. So a majority of Democrats and a majority of Republicans voted for that law. Whereas the red line is the ones that pass with only one party in majority support. And what you can see is that when we pass major laws, they tend to be bipartisan. And there are two exceptions, 1993 and 2009, and they were associated with massive electoral backlashes in the other direction. That is, when Democrats passed a bunch of liberal laws on their own in 1993, Republicans took over Congress. When Democrats passed a bunch of liberal laws on their own in 2009, it was associated with the Tea Party response in 2010. So it happens rarely, and it usually isn't very popular. Most of the time, we get bipartisan policymaking. So what does it look like when the parties do compromise? Well, it gets pretty complicated. This is the Republican slide about Obamacare here. They said it's a really complicated system. But I want to get at why it gets to be that complicated. It's often because Democratic politicians are trying to respond to conservative concerns. That is, they're not just saying, let's lower the eligibility for Medicare from 65 to 25. They are saying, let's have a system based on private competition. Let's have a system that the states design. Let's have a system that has more consumer choice. Those are all conservative principles that they are trying to apply, but by expanding government, right? So they want a new government program, but they want it to be as least offensive as possible to those conservative principles, because they know that America does not necessarily share their broader liberal principles. And this has widespread effects. One is real devolution. This is the number of employees in the federal government and the number of employees in the state and local governments. There's been a long-term shift down to state and local governments. Similarly, this is the number of government civilian employees. This is the number of grantees, people working full-time because they received a government grant. And that is the number of people working full-time for the government because they received a contract. And what you can see is we're doing a whole lot more of our work through business, through the private sector, through contractors, and through nonprofits and state and local government, through grantees. And so we really have reduced the visible size of government, but we really haven't reduced its scope. We're asking government to do more things, but we're trying to do it in a more complicated fashion. All right, so what about 2016? What's changed and not changed? We had some different candidates. We had a more full-throated liberal candidate in Bernie Sanders, and we had a Republican candidate who was less tied to conservative ideology. So what has actually changed? Well, there is some change in the Democratic side. There's more liberals. So this is 2012 to 2016. First of all, notice there's still some conservatives in the Democratic Party and some moderates. This is the voters. Still some conservatives and moderates, but less than there were before. And this is activists. The activists are getting quite liberal, and this is donors. The donors are also getting quite liberal. So there is change in the base of the Democratic Party in just the last 4 years. But Republicans have also been moving even more conservative. They're just at their peak, basically. There aren't any more liberals in the Republican Party. This is a chart just showing you how each party feels about the other party. So this is how Republicans feel about conservatives, and this is how Republicans feel about liberals. You can see there's a huge gap. This is Democrats. You can see Democrats felt equally good about each until the 1980s. And then you started to see a gap, and today there's a gap in how Democrats rate conservatives and liberals, but it's not as big as the gap of Republicans. Very recently what we saw is a polarization around liberals. More Democrats being willing to say they like liberals, and Republicans saying they dislike liberals even more. But notice, Democrats are still, giving Republicans about a 50 on a scale of 0 to 100. I'm sorry, giving conservatives about 50 on a scale of 0 to 100. So there's a lot of Democrats that aren't necessarily feeling negative about conservatives. So what else happened in 2016? Well, there was actually a fairly typical pattern that may be surprising to some, and that is that the candidate that was closer to the median voter won the election, although got fewer popular votes. And that is that Hillary Clinton was rated as a fairly typical Democrat in liberalism. We had the placement of the American electorate stay about the same, slightly conservative is where the median member of the electorate is. And Donald Trump successfully made himself seem more moderate than the Republican Party as a whole, closer to the moderate end. And so you can see, if you're the average voter here, voting for Donald Trump is actually closer to your perceived ideology than voting for Hillary Clinton. There was also some change, obviously, affecting our areas in the upper Midwest. And you can see a very big regional pattern in the shift in vote from 2012 to 2016. Notice the South doesn't show much change, but that's because all of the white working class voters in the South had already moved to the Republican side. So the people who looked like Southerners who had moved to the Republican side over the last 20 years in this election moved further to the Republican side. There was also some change in media, but it reflected the basic pattern. This is from a new analysis of shared links between Democrats and Republicans. What you can see is Democrats were basically concentrated around these mainstream news outlets, although the Huffington Post makes an appearance there. The Republicans had a much more separated conservative news base, and you can see Breitbart comes out as the most linked to site among Republicans. There was also a change in the determinants of the vote. This is a new question that I asked in 2016. We said, by accepting diverse cultures and lifestyles, our country is steadily improving. Agree or disagree? And what we found is that Republicans, Trump supporters, were much more likely to disagree with that statement, and Clinton supporters were the ones who were likely to agree with it. So there was a difference here in how voters were reacting to the speed of social change in the American electorate. And it, I think, made some people vote for the Democratic candidate and some vote for the Republican candidate. We also asked it another way. We said that our country is changing too fast, undermining traditional American values, and you saw the opposite pattern. So people who think the country is changing too fast, diversifying, don't like that, voted for Trump. On the other side, people voted for Clinton. There was also more polarization this year on racial attitudes. This is a traditional question we ask about. Many minorities overcame prejudice. African Americans should do the same without any favors. People who strongly disagreed with that voted overwhelmingly for Hillary Clinton and vice versa for Donald Trump. Now, one thing I thought might change this year was class politics. And that is, for a very long time, the number one positive thing voters have said about the Democratic Party is that it's the party of the working class. And for a very long time, the number one thing that people have said they like about the Republican Party is that it's conservative. And the number one thing they've said they dislike about the Republican Party is that it's the party of big business and the upper class. So there's been this class differentiation in how voters see the political parties, and I expected that it could potentially change. So this is not pretty, but we'll give you some sense. This is from 2016. The same voters were asked what they like about the parties. This is just everything they said. You can see conservatism was still the number one thing voters liked about the Republican Party, and the number one thing they didn't like is that they don't like people. Well, that's a mix of lots of things people said, but they said, oh, they don't like these people or they don't like these other people. Democrats, it was more positively about the people in the party and more negative about government, liberalism, too much, money, etc. So this is a pretty typical pattern with one exception, and that is that usually Republican dislike is much more about being rich. You can see that made it up there, but not overwhelmingly. But there was a difference in how the candidates were portrayed, and I think it was partially driven by the advertising campaigns. The Clinton campaign ran the most negative personal campaign ever. That is, its ads were overwhelmingly focused on the personal qualities of Donald Trump rather than public policy, and they were more negative than ever. You can see that that really stands out historically. Most ad campaigns are about policy, and they are relatively positive. And so, as a result, we did get personal ratings of the candidates that were a little bit different this time. The things people liked about Donald Trump personally is that he's a businessman. The things they don't like about them is that he's racist. The things they do like about Clinton is that she's experienced. The things they don't like about her is they don't trust her. She's a liar. So from the American public's perspective, we had an election between the parties perceived pretty normally, but candidates that were perceived a little bit different. A racist businessman versus an experienced liar. And that's in part how people made their decisions. But policy has not necessarily lived up to how the Republican candidate portrayed himself. This is the most conservative administration by appointments. That's something we can measure fairly easily. Every member of the cabinet that Trump has appointed has been more conservative than the equivalent cabinet member that Bush appointed. So there doesn't seem to be much sign of a move to the left or the center by the Trump administration. But paradoxically, that might be good news because the tradition has been for us to have a pendulum between left and right because the Republican Party moves things too far to the right and the Democratic Party moves things too far to the left, and the public says, oh, no, 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 to both of those things. So what this chart says is the more laws, the more liberal laws you pass, the more public opinion becomes conservative. The more conservative laws you pass, the more public opinion becomes liberal. So public opinion was moving liberal under the Reagan administration. It was moving conservative under the Clinton administration. And so it might seem like a tragedy for the Republicans that they weren't able to pass the health care bill, but I would argue historically it will be a good thing because the more conservative laws Donald Trump is able to pass, the more likely, the bigger the backlash will be. And we have a fairly stable pattern back and forth between the parties. Whoever wins one presidential election is immediately favored to lose the next presidential election over time. And it tends to extend throughout the political system, not just to the presidential election, of course, but to congressional elections and state legislative elections. People are largely judging the party of the president on their performance. And the way that they are often judging, of course they judge partially on the economy, but the other way that they are judging is, did the party move policy too far in its direction over the course of its administration? The bigger the move, the bigger the backlash. All right, thank you. Is that good? Much time?
Yeah.
All right.
Any questions?
Yes, I have some questions. You talked about the Southern Democrats leaving the Democratic Party you didn't mention though that that had a lot to do with the Civil Rights Act that was passed by,
Well, they didn't leave, they lost. Right.
they simply left. They didn't, it wasn't that the Democrats didn't want them anymore. I mean, they left, they moved themselves to the other side because they were, they had, because of the Lyndon Johnson civil rights laws.
Well, there's some truth to that, but I would not agree completely. First of all, in Congress, they did directly depose Southern Conservative Committee chairs from there. There was an actual liberal movement to get the conservatives out of the leadership of the Democratic Party. Even in the electorate, it isn't as confident as people normally suggest that it's all about civil rights. In fact, the first places to move in the southern United States were the suburbs, the richer places that had been moving already in the Eisenhower era towards the Republicans. And it really wasn't until the 1980s and 1990s that the more Wallace-supporting white working class areas started moving towards the Republican Party. So eventually, yes, there was a racial realignment, but that didn't start the change in the South. I think partly what changed the party in the South was that the Democratic Party moved to the left, and the conservatives no longer felt that they were attached to the party that was the more liberal party.
Well, isn't the civil rights, passing the civil rights law, isn't that a
Certainly a part of
reflection of that exactly? Yeah,
Absolutely.
right, okay. And then, did I understand you to say that the Democrats don't like rich, or the Republicans, which is use them, when you use that word, I wasn't real clear on that.
So we ask people every election, we say, what do you dislike about the Republican Party? And for every election since the 1950s, the number one answer has been they're the party of big business or the rich or the upper class.
Okay.
This is the public as a whole, but it's especially pronounced among Democrats.
Democrats say that about Republicans?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
You've dealt with all this at the national level.
Yes.
Does it change at the state level? Because the Republicans have been, in the last 8 years, remarkably successful in getting control of state houses and governorships.
Yes, and it goes back a little further. I mean, since there was a move back under the Bush administration, but basically it's been in the opposite direction of the presidency. So under the Clinton administration, there was a huge move to the right in state legislatures, back a little bit under the Bush administration, and then way back to the right under the Obama administration. There's differences of opinion about how successful they have been in terms of moving policy to the right. I would say it kind of depends on your baseline. If your baseline is that they've enacted less liberal policy, then that's certainly the case, right? California and New York have continued enacting new liberal policies, and conservative states haven't. But if your baseline is, have they reduced the size and scope of government in conservative states, the answer is usually no. Yes?
Do you think the progressive movement that followed Bernie Sanders throughout his 2016 campaign has pushed the Democratic Party enough to produce more liberal Democratic candidates rather than conservative Democratic candidates?
Well, I'll say a couple of things. Number one, again, remember, it wasn't the case that there weren't Democratic candidates who held liberal policy positions. They often held liberal policy positions. So the question is whether he can move people towards more full-throated, saying that they are liberals, saying that they want to expand the size and scope of government, saying that they want to borrow from international systems, as he did. Those are very uncommon things for a Democratic candidate to say. I would say so far we haven't seen a whole lot of evidence in congressional elections, but I'm open to the possibility that we will. It is somewhat analogous, for example, to the 1978 Republicans who favored Reagan and went out and deposed the more liberal members of their political party. So if we start to see, say, Democrats in West Virginia saying, we'll just lose the Senate seat, we want to get rid of Joe Manchin, or the same thing in North Dakota, that would be a sign that we're starting to see something on the left that looks like the conservative insurgency on the right. But so far we haven't seen it.
Did I hear you to say that the U.S. has fewer political parties than basically any other country in the world?
Democratic country, yeah.
Is that because of our setup?
Most people would point to the electoral system. Why does the U.S. have so few political parties? There's a whole bunch of reasons, but most people say that the number one reasons are we have single-member districts, and we have a presidential system.
As opposed to a parliament?
Yes, as opposed to a parliament and a party list system, which tends to produce a whole lot of parties, where you vote for a party instead of an individual member, or a multi-member district system. Yes.
If both parties are creating their own news outlets and only listening to their own news outlets, it seems as though we have a cultural war in America almost at the moment. Is there any solution or movement to break this kind of divide that we've created for ourselves?
Well, so first of all, I don't think it's both parties. There is an increase in cable news viewership on both sides, but there is still a big gap between Democrats and Republicans that watch cable news channels. And Democrats that watch these channels are much more likely to also watch a whole bunch of mainstream networks. And the reason for that is that Democrats still trust those mainstream networks as much as their explicitly liberal alternative. They trust NBC and ABC and CBS, whereas Republicans really only trust conservative news outlets. Now, there's a whole bunch of different evidence about the extent to which people are moving into completely different informational cocoons. Keep in mind that the number one source of news is still local TV news. A lot of people still watch relatively non-political, non-conservative or liberal news. A whole lot of the public just isn't paying much attention to politics until 3 weeks before the election day anyway. So yes, there's cocoons, but the cocoons are among the most interested, most partisan people, and there's a difference in how Democrats and Republicans are relating to that. But yeah, to answer the broader question, I think it is a self-reinforcing cycle, especially on the right, where the content of the news reinforces that mainstream news is not trustworthy, and you need to stick with explicitly conservative alternatives. And that content has worked to keep those viewers more, and listeners in talk radio, more attached to their explicitly conservative news.
In this astute audience, I hate to even ask a question, but would you go back to the beginning where you tried to comment probably on how you gathered this data to reach these conclusions that you're showing us on the screen? What is your technique?
Whole bunch of different data. So every slide is different data.
Can you repeat the question again?
Oh yes, where did we get the data to draw these conclusions? So every slide is a little bit different data, but the main kinds of data that we ended up adding were about the content of the speeches and texts produced by each political party. So what we did is we had a team of enterprising young undergraduates take each snippet of text and try to rate it by a fairly complex scheme as a general principle, a specific policy position, or a reference to a social or interest group, and then there were 5 other things that I'm not showing here. And then they also rated the policy mentions and the mentions of principles based on a big scheme of whether they were liberal, conservative, or neither types of principles.
Can I assume that in your book you have, as a footnote or whatever?
Oh yeah, everything
you
is
have
documented.
identified the
Yeah.
groups and the people and their locations, what part of the country? I mean, I'm assuming there's a lot more given in your book than what you presented here.
So
I'm having trouble digesting all of
I
your conclusions.
threw a lot of data at you. I know. This is based on texts. So they looked at the speeches given by presidential candidates at the convention, and that was all of them, and it was representative of every speech that's been given since 1948. Whenever I show you public opinion data, it is representative of the public. It's from a national sample, or I think there's one case of a state sample, but it is supposed to be representative of public opinion as a whole. So, for example, this graph, this is it's the average of every single policy question that has been asked of the American electorate in each year. And we just say, what's the percent of time that people give a liberal answer versus a percent of time that they give a conservative answer. And similarly, this is every single question that was asked by any news media organization or any academic source about the general size and scope of government. And this is telling you the percent of times that people give you the liberal answer on that versus the conservative answer.
One other part of my question, I noticed you gave no credit to public television or public radio. Was that because of your choice, or was that because people didn't analyze that as much?
Democrats do disproportionately listen to public radio and public television, although public TV, PBS is actually the one news outlet that gets higher ratings from Republicans, other than Fox News. It still doesn't get great ratings, but it gets much higher ratings.
But that's not reflected in any of your data.
Yeah, it is. So this is, where am I? So for example, this is the average. When I say mainstream networks, PBS is one of the 5 networks. That's
Okay, I was just concerned because you didn't really mention that in your footnote up here.
Yeah.
No, this PBS is right
Yeah,
there.
it is, NBC, ABC, CBS.
Oh, PBS, oh, no.
You couldn't read that fast.
Yeah, no. I threw it all at you, and yes, if you want the details, they are all in the book, yes.
Yeah, how would you respond to Gore Vidal's observation that the Republicans and Democrats are 2 wings of the same party, and the overall result seems to be the same wars, the same bank bailouts, the same mass incarceration, privatization of the commons, etc.
So I don't think they're the same parties in terms of their public positions, and you can see, based on ratings of their positions across the international space, that Republicans end up looking like a much more conservative party than the Democrats. But that's different than the policy results, right? So what are the policy results of the parties? Well, the policy results, remember, are going to be almost always driven by the combination of the parties. You rarely get any kind of major policy change unless Democrats and Republicans are in agreement.
I rest my case.
Yeah. So absolutely, it can be the case that the parties can have very different positions publicly, but the actual results that we get reflect only the intersection, usually, where both parties are in agreement.
I wanted to go back and ask a little bit more about the data, and let me first say I'm so thankful that you're able to provide so many points of data and charts, because it can seem so complicated, the concepts, but once I can see it, it starts to make more sense.
Yeah, and let me just real quick just say that we are relying on lots of data collected by lots of other people here. So this is not, we did not collect all of this. We're trying to aggregate other people's data. I showed you, the slides where I said we originally collected this, but most of the data comes from elsewhere. Sorry.
So my question is kind of about that. As someone in education, you mentioned you work with students. Can you give me a little bit of insight about what are some challenges for collecting the data, or even how you come about thinking about the questions you want to ask, or that's going to drive your data? Just some insight, even perhaps as us to go back and look at our own data sets, or maybe there's good websites that you use, things like that.
Yeah, so the first thing I'd say is we tried to look overwhelmingly at the previous literature in the particular areas, because we didn't want to repeat something that somebody had already done. So where possible, where there were already studies at Fox News, we used those studies. We didn't want to replicate them unless we needed to, or unless there wasn't research in that area. We also did use, the widest publicly available sources. So for example, some of this is from a website that I recommend called the Policy Agendas Project, where they look at a whole bunch of different things and categorize them by issue area. But one of the things that they do is they have an index where you can create your own graphs based on public opinion data on whatever you want. So if you just want to know what's the average liberalism on healthcare, you can create your own graph to do that. So there is some, we try to point out in the book where there's kind of a, you can do it yourself in terms of making this data. But yeah, we try to rely on other people wherever we could, but that often, required going to talk to them or asking for their data or saying, here's how you reviewed it, was there a difference between Democrats and Republicans, or something along those lines. Yes?
I I realize I've already asked a question, so.
Well, the other person who raised their hand also had,
Yes.
so that was
Yes.
going to
So
defer.
go ahead.
If it's true that when governments enact policies, they always, that somehow is inherently that ends up being a more liberal thing than maybe they would have campaigned on, so to speak. Am I to conclude then that really ideological people, that the real Tea Party, hardcore, they're doomed to be eternally angry and frustrated?
Well, there's a good reason they're frustrated, right? They've sent people to DC who have claimed that they're going to scale back the size and scope of government, who have claimed that they're going to reverse the direction of social change in the US, and that hasn't been possible. And so, yes, that has produced pretty regular frustration and outbursts, and uniquely in the Republican Party, not just against the opposition party, but against their own party leadership as selling out their principles. So yes, I think that dynamic is pretty regular. Now, we should also point out though that we're getting pretty low levels of policy making as well. So we have reduced the overall level of policy making overall, but certainly, if you look at this from a conservative perspective, you would conclude that gridlock might not be great, but it's better than the next best thing, which is an upsurge of liberal policy making. Yep.
Let me ask you a question I asked you this morning, but it might be interesting for others to hear as well. So I asked, do you see that there is some kind of watershed moment where the Republican Party moved towards more that purity of, ideologically speaking, both organizationally as well as electoral?
Yeah, so when was the watershed moments in the Republican Party? I do want to point out, because I focused on the data in this lecture, that if you read the book, you'll get a misimpression because about at least half of the book is pure history. So in addition to looking for the data, we tried to look for what is the historical narrative that either supports or doesn't support the conventional understanding. And so the clear historical cases, I would say, are about a different pattern in the party organizations versus in elected officials. So in party organizations, the watershed moment is clearly the Goldwater campaign, and it was associated with a takeover of Republican Party organizations from 1960 to 1964, including the women's organization and the college students and every Republican organization you can think of, and every state party you can think of. There was a active movement to take over control of Republican Party institutions from any liberals or any non-conservatives. But that wasn't actually reflected in Congress and the presidency until 1978 and 1980. So they took over the party first, so if you want to say what will the Bernie folks do, it might be 20 years between taking over the party apparatus and actually seeing results in Congress or the presidency that actually match that. Because the other historical watershed is Reagan's loss to Ford in 1976, which created an energy and an infrastructure to go and challenge people in primaries and in general elections to move the Republican Party to the right.
As a very accomplished and professional practitioner of analyzing a lot of these surveys and polls, my question to you, I'd really be interested in your opinion. How did they get the results of this last election so wrong? What went haywire with their polling and surveying techniques? What happened?
Well, yes, what went haywire with the polls in 2016? I guess I'll question a little bit. The national poll average was only 1.5% off, which is below average for a polling error and not reflective of any problems in national polls. State polls also were not off by more than average. We just tend to get angry, for obvious reasons, when they get the wrong result, in addition to being off. But for example, in 2012 and 2008, the polls were actually more off They were against Obama, and Obama did better in the state polls and the national polls than expected. Then the average state polls were off in 2016. So there's error in polls. The reported margin of error, if you think about that as kind of just the sampling error, you got to think about all the other sources of error in a poll. Only 2 to 12% of people respond to the poll. So there could be a difference in who picks up the phone or who's willing to talk to pollsters. We try to account for that in all sorts of ways, but there's all sorts of ways things can go wrong when you're dealing with that level of responses. So I think just as a rule of thumb, I would kind of double that margin of error, because even our best polls of like presidential approval, for example, have variation equal to about double the margin of error. So even when we're asking an extremely simple question over and over with great polling organizations, our error is still about twice as much as we would expect from stats alone.
So my question after, seeing your full presentation, can Republicans ever govern? Because they don't talk policy, they talk only ideology, and a case in point could be the healthcare debacle that we just went through.
It's absolutely the case that healthcare is an example of where, people were in favor of lots of the individual provisions of Obamacare, but they thought overall it was too much government intervention in the economy, and so they rebelled against it once enacted. On the Republican side, they thought they wanted to get rid of Obamacare, but once they saw the details, the public was opposed to getting rid of those individual benefits. So it's absolutely true that that's a problem for the Republican Party. How it has usually resolved it is for a new president to come in and do some liberal things in addition to some conservative things. So Bush, the other Bush, Reagan, Nixon, Ford, they all came in with agendas that were mixes of liberal and conservative policy proposals. They found some things where they wanted to expand the role of government, and they accompanied their more conservative policy proposals with those proposals. So what we're seeing now, I think there were a lot of people who thought Trump would introduce infrastructure, introduce some kinds of policies that would be more appealing to Democrats. He still has a chance to go that way. He could pull an Arnold Schwarzenegger. Arnold in California spent the first 2 years being a conservative, then he lost a bunch of initiative campaigns, and then spent the next years being a liberal. So it's still possible, but we haven't seen any evidence of that so far. This has been the most conservative administration ever in terms of policy proposals in Congress, in terms of policy actions in the administration, and in terms of personnel in the administration. So there's no sign yet that he's moving left on any issue.
So we might be able to conclude that they really can't govern. It's going to be years of gridlock because they can't govern.
Well, I also told this to Henrik earlier. I said, it depends on what your expectations are, right? 2009 was a historically high era of policy change. We passed a whole bunch of things all at once that expanded the scope of government. That's not the norm. That's only happened twice, and both times were associated with big backlashes. So even when you win, not you necessarily, but even when the Bernie folks win, if they are able to enact a whole bunch of liberal policies, it'll be associated with a big conservative backlash in the electorate. So both parties have a problem. When they enact their policies, the public tends to move in the other direction.
So on a personal level, not only for you, but your colleagues as well, do you find that as you get more and more into the academic area of this, less in the trenches, less a war healer type of an attitude, that you become more apolitical? That you look at it more as just a study, that it's more academic to you than it is political? Would you say that's fair or not?
Well, overall, I'd say our evidence is the more you get engaged in something, the more politicized you get. So if what's true of the general public applies to academics, then you would expect them to get more politicized. In terms of the political trends, academics are moving liberal over time. They started more liberal and they're moving even more liberal. So I don't see a whole lot of evidence that people are kind of coming out somewhere in the middle. But I do think a lot of political scientists, what a lot of political scientists do try to do is think about it from the perspective of the actors and what they are trying to achieve, and given what they are trying to achieve, is this the best approach? And you said they couldn't govern, but given that if we said their approach is to try to reduce the size and scope of government or reverse the direction of social change, they're doing as much as possible.
What are your thoughts on the viability of the Republican Party as we currently see it today?
I think it's quite viable. I think that all of the talk of crisis is not it does not match the current results, which is that they're in the strongest position ever in terms of their control of American institutions. If the last election showed anything, I think it was that the theories that we would see an emerging Democratic majority because of ethnic and racial change were not borne out, and in fact they weren't borne out because as the country becomes more ethnically diverse, the role of white identity in American politics appears to be going up. So it is not the case that there's going to be a inherent a Democratic majority just because of increases in ethnic diversity, and I think we saw that last election.
You don't think the Republican Party will self-implode?
No.
One last question.
I have a question for you with regards to the graphs in there that you had about Fox News and all the rest of that. Last fall, I was seeing posts on there that basically were saying that people who didn't follow the news at all actually were better informed than people who watch Fox News. Do you have any thing that would either disprove or that statement or verify?
By the typical measures that we ask, people who watch cable news are not less informed. So we usually ask you, who is the vice president? Can you name a Supreme Court justice? These kinds of factual-based questions, and cable news can be informative when it comes to those basic features compared to somebody who's only watching sports and weather. Those people are going to get information. But when it comes to information with a partisan content, absolutely. If you ask a bunch of people who watch Fox News, is Obama a Muslim? Was he born in Kenya? All of that kind of stuff, you're going to get people who watch that being less informed than the public who doesn't.
All right, thank you very much, for your information-rich talk and answers. I want to just announce our next event. First of all, one more thing is, if you think that talk was information-rich, read his book, Asymmetric Politics, and you can actually become really smarter about American politics. So what I want to announce, our next event is on October 23rd at 4:30 here, and we'll talk about civil rights in the 1960s here at Ripon College, as well as civil rights today. We have two Ripon alums in the 1960s here who have very interesting things to say. So thanks again for coming, and have a good evening.